You ready, Joshua?
Okay.
Okay. Thanks for showing up, everybody. My name is Claire Strawn. I'm with the Cooperation Eugene, and we're delighted to host this panel because what we're about is developing solutions-based approaches that start building infrastructure for the next systems as this one crumbles. So a couple housekeeping tips. Please mute yourself to limit background noise. This will be recorded, and if you would like to be on a mailing list to get background information and documents, if you would put your email into the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box to pose questions to the panelists, so that's the place to do that. If you've never used the chat box, you bring your cursor down to the bottom of the screen and you'll see a little call out button that says chat, and that's where you type it in. So with those things, I'm going to turn it on over to the panelists, and thanks again for being here and doing this work.
Thanks, Claire. My name's Jennifer Frenzer-Knowlton, and Michael Kerrigan and I are going to be co-facilitating the meeting. So if you have any logistical questions or concerns, you can chat, send us a little message in the chat. Claire's actually going to be monitoring the chat for your present questions for the presenters. So please make sure that you add your questions to the queue. And the topic today is divesting and investing in housing, not handcuffs. So this is a conversation about the criminalization, the decriminalization of the unhoused. And we have three speakers. We have Heather Selecki from Whitebird Clinic. We have Paul Bowden from the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. And we have Lori Haber from Legal Aid of Lane County. So we're going to start today with Heather and hear her comments on what's going on in Eugene, Oregon and Lane County.
So hi everyone, I'm Heather Selicki, and I moved to Eugene about 12 years ago, and really was just raising a newborn and didn't really understand all of the housing crisis that was going on. Got involved with neighborhood associations and disaster preparedness, and a protest encampment came to our neighborhood, and that's when I really realized the scope of the housing crisis here in Eugene, and that we were already in a disaster that we hadn't prepared for. And I looked to the government and to the faith communities to see what they were doing, and I saw it wasn't enough. I looked to activists like Paul Bowden and Eric Tars and Diane Yentl to give advice on what to do. And I went to Whitebird because I saw that they were advocates in the community who were really taking a humanistic approach. So when Cahoots started to get the spotlight in Whitebird Clinic, I reached out to Paul because I really trust his advice. I know he's been involved with homelessness for such a long time. And what he told me made me want to bring him here to Eugene so that everyone could hear what he had to say. And I'll introduce his background. He served as the executive director of San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness for 6 services. And he served as board for 10 years. He's a member of the National Coalition for the Homeless and co-chair of its civil rights and grassroots organizing group. So we're so grateful to have him here today. And he's joined here by Lori Haber, staff attorney from Oregon Law Center, Lane County Legal Aid. And her area of focus includes the criminalization of homelessness and the creation of more shelter and housing options for people who are unhoused and affordable housing. So I think we're gonna have a great conversation today. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Paul.
Yeah, hey, Heather, thank you so much. It's great to be talking to people in Eugene again. And WRAP, Western Regional Advocacy Project, was created about 15 years ago by a bunch of us that were doing local organizing and felt really strongly that we were losing the debate on or even attempts by the federal government to do a cause and effect assessment on why we started opening shelters in America again in the early 1980s. Prior to 1982, there weren't any general public or family or youth emergency shelter programs in the United States. We hadn't seen them since the Great Depression. And you'll think back, what we today call HUD was created in 1937. And we have amazing artwork from local governments that were pushing for the creation of a federal agency to address the housing needs of poor people in their communities. And in 1937, that agency was the Public Housing Administration. It was created. That second slide will show you. Heather, if you can skip to the next slide, it'll show you the mandate in 1937 was very clear, very direct, and very accountable that there was a responsibility to ensure and to remedy the unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and to ensure that people had housing. Now, implementation is always different, and there were really racist policies attached to these housing programs, but there was an acknowledgement by the federal government that there was a responsibility. 1998, which was actually 16 years after we opened our emergency shelter programs as part of what they were then calling the Contract with America by Gingrich, and this was actually signed by Clinton, they changed that preamble and that mandate for HUD from what it was to what it says here, which is that it cannot be held accountable for even a majority. So you have to understand that there's a twist here, because simultaneous to this, the mortgage interest deduction program went from around $40 billion a year. It's now $140 billion a year. That's subsidizing home ownership. The affordable housing programs went from 78 equivalent. You'll see a chart if you go to the next slide. Now, this was just within Public Housing, McKinney, and Hope 6 programs, and these are all 2004 constant dollars. You can see the massive decline that precipitated opening emergency shelters. You can see every program that's been done in the interim hasn't addressed what created the situation in the first place. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what has replaced the condition, the funding that was allocated for affordable housing, and it was anti-homeless laws. We have this report now that UC Berkeley Law School did with us, tracking the increase in the numbers of anti-homeless laws. And we've now done the same in Oregon with the ACLU, in Colorado with Denver University. You know, what local governments have done in response to massive homelessness in America is criminalize the presence of homeless people and increase enforcement in criminalizing the presence of homeless people. And so you go to the next slide, Heather, please. And you'll see that we have to, tie these issues together. The neoliberal approach to the only housing that's worthwhile is commodified housing, and that's earning interest and money for the mortgage industry and the banks and the developers, versus housing that's a community benefit for human beings. And the top 3 criminal offenses, when we went out and documented conversations with over 1,600 people, and some of these outreaches were done in Eugene, was sleeping, sitting, and standing still. Those are the top 3 criminal offenses. And so from that, the next slide is the Right to Rest Act. And when you go out and you do that, as part of looking into those laws, what we did was we went and did some research. And the research told us very clearly that these laws have been used in the past targeting other community members. Today, they seem to be primarily targeting homeless people. But we need to put this in a contextualized environment where we're talking about neoliberal economic policies, we're talking about racism, and we're talking about systemic classism. If housing is good for wealthy people and we need to subsidize it to 140 billion, why wouldn't housing also be good for poorer income people? If human rights are what we stand for as a country, how come we have such a repetitive balance from ugly laws and Basurero Treaty and Japanese American exclusion laws and sit sundown towns and sit lie laws? Why is it we have this incredibly long, rich history of passing local ordinances and then focusing the enforcement on those within the community that the power elite wanna see chased out? If homelessness exists very clearly because of a federal structural issue, then the people that are suffering from that injustice, that were not in Congress, didn't vote on these budgets, had no say whatsoever in the decision to wipe out the affordable housing programs or to do welfare reform or to do Hope 6 or to cut the community-based residential treatment that was so vital after deinstitutionalization. You know, people like to say that the deinstitutionalization put mentally ill people out in the street. That's actually not true. Deinstitutionalization for about 5 years was followed by community-based residential treatment programs that were spread throughout a community. It was the elimination of those programs that put mentally ill, indigent people out into our streets. So on each of these instances, we can go back and look at cause and effect. And if having these laws on the books, that means discriminatory enforcement, like we tried to do with the Right to Rest Act in Oregon, get those laws off the books. That if you want to end Jim Crow and you want to end sundown towns, get rid of the laws that make up the backbone of those programs. If you want to address homelessness, nothing ends homelessness like a home. So even though the name itself tells you that. So focus your programs not on fictional housing first, not on outreach programs attached to police departments or 911, 311 call-in numbers, not on sweeps, not on closing parks, but while people are homeless, if they're not bothering anybody, leave them the hell alone, and focus all your energy on the restoration of community-based residential treatment for those that need it, not as, well, they're homeless, so therefore they need wraparound services. That's not true. I was homeless. A social worker wasn't going to end my homelessness. A place to live ended my homelessness. And have the affordable housing available for the poorest people in your community. Restore the project-based Section 8 program. Housing choice vouchers are a total misnomer because the choice is the landlords. The choice is not the poor person with the voucher. So don't say that you're giving them a choice. What you're doing is going for the cheapest bang for the buck. Just as case management replaced doctors and professionals in treatment programs, and I was a case manager in a mental health program, just as we were so much cheaper than actual treatment, so too is a housing choice program versus a project-based Section 8 where the unit stays affordable to poor people and not the other way around. So those, I think, are the focuses of where we're pushing things. There is Representative Omar has introduced the Homes for All Act. We're even having a hard time getting the Democrats to support it, but it is doable. It is something that we can focus on the national level. It does solidly reinvest a federal funding for permanent affordable housing for the poorest members of our community. And I thank you very much for your time.
Wow. Thank you, Paul.
You said keep it quick.
Yeah, well, we'll have a lot of time for questions, and I think that there will be a lot of questions, actually. But that was an amazing presentation. Lori is going to give us some information about a recent case in Oregon, Grants Pass, and what kinds of lessons our advocates in Eugene can glean from that case, and also what sort of just the takeaway from the Grants Pass case for us.
So, Jennifer, did you want to say a few words about the prior effort in 2015, or do you want me to go first and then you do that?
Go for it. When it makes sense for us to, Ken and I can jump in.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, Paul, that was very inspiring. Hard to follow you because I'm diving a little bit into more of the nitty gritty. But just quickly, I want to take a step back, and following up on what Paul was saying, I want to remind everyone that what we're talking about are laws that disproportionately impact the unhoused because of their status. And that, as we know in Eugene, is because people have nowhere to go. So if someone's sleeping or resting in a public location, we know that means they violate the prohibited camping ordinance. If someone is in a public park, that's a park violation. And if someone is on private property, that's criminal trespass too. So literally, there's absolutely no place in Eugene where someone can legally sleep without getting a violation. And then the other thing I want to let those of you on this Zoom meeting, if you haven't heard me speak on this issue before, I have spent, I don't know, 18 months looking at the laws that are most commonly used against the unhoused. And I won't go into that now. And if anyone who hasn't seen it, there's a full-blown report. And many people on this Zoom call were part of the group who gave me extensive feedback. And that report went from the Poverty and Homelessness Working Group of the Human Rights Commission to the HRC, and then the HRC sponsored or endorsed the report and requested a work session of City Council. So we can come back to that, but a work session is still kind of on the plate of City Council at some point. And so what is this grants pass case about? Just briefly, 4 plaintiffs represent the class. And before I even get into the case, this was a success just getting this class definition, because basically, even though it's only 4 plaintiffs, these 4 plaintiffs are certified as representatives of every single person in Grants Pass who is involuntarily homeless and has no access to shelter, which is basically everyone in Grants Pass. And so the ruling applies to everyone who's unhoused in Grants Pass. So what I'm trying to highlight today are what I think are the most salient parts of this case that we can apply in Eugene in order to continue to pressure for change and basically do exactly what Paul was talking about. So first, they speak about the precedent that was established in Martin v. Boise. And when there's 2 components to this that I think are very relevant. One is they basically say you can't allow people to sleep, but then say it's illegal to sleep if you have any material to keep yourself warm and dry. And so basically, a city has to allow people to have some kind of basic bedding material. And they emphasize that in a few locations. The other thing they spoke to, which was essential in Martin v. Boise, is the basic math, is that when there's far more homeless people than available shelter beds, you cannot cite people for prohibited camping. And so the relevant analysis is more people than shelter beds available, which we all know that is an issue in Eugene, despite some of the innovative programs that we have here. Another part of this case that really, I think, advances the argument beyond where Martin v. Boise left off is saying the distinction between criminal and civil violations is not dispositive. And because if you recall, what the city has said over and over is that the difference is they don't fall under Martin v. Boise because the violation for prohibited camping is only a fine. It's a $200 fine. There's no jail time. And that's how they've distinguished Eugene's situation from Boise. However, essentially, I won't go into more detail, but what the court said in this Grants Pass case is that is not a valid distinction, because in that case, it was $295. But basically, whether it's $200 or $295, they said, the court said that it's it's still punishment for a person's unavoidable status. And so they've eliminated that distinction. So I think that really helps advance our cause here. So related to that is that they found that Grants Pass $295 fine was excessive under the 8th Amendment for cruel and unusual punishment. And basically what they wrote is, someone can't afford shelter. There's no way they can afford a $200 fine. So basically, they're being punished for what they described as unavoidable life-sustaining acts of sleeping and resting. And they recognized what we, as all of you on this Zoom call, have been saying, which is these kind of fines make it more difficult for people to then be able to find housing. And so basically it's excessive, and it's excessive when it's imposed based on someone's status and not their conduct. They also spoke to park exclusion, and a lot of you have heard me harp on the park violations, because the park violations are even more excessive than prohibited camping, because park violations are a misdemeanor. They include both a $500 fine and jail time. And basically, the court said that Grants Pass was unfair in that they deprived people of access to the parks before they even had a hearing. And the process they have in Grants Pass is fairly similar to what we have in Eugene. Okay. And it's draconian because people are excluded from parks from 30 days up to a year. And so that's also something I think we can really grab onto here. The other thing is they also spoke about COVID, and the court has very specific language about the dangers of uprooting people who are unhoused, and basically saying if you don't provide people with sanitation and waste disposal that meets their needs, you're just shifting a public health crisis from one location to another by closing camps. And then there's other language about the costs of this and what a waste of a public resource, and how unpaid fines impacts credit histories, which makes it harder to find housing and employment, which is what we've been saying for months. And so there's a lot in this case that I think as advocates we can really use to advance our position. So with that, I'm sure I've gone over. So Jennifer, I'll pass it back to you.
That was a great synopsis of that case. Thank you. And there will be, those are talking points and action items for us to organize around. And I guess I just really quickly wanted to, catch up people where Ken and I left off with the 2015 City Council resolutions to address criminalization, which they didn't, and also to look at the housing first model. And they've kind of used that as a battering ram. But one of the points that I wanted to reiterate was that at that point in time, what we were discussing as a Human Rights Commission and as a small group, our work group on homelessness and poverty was a three-prong approach, that we were seeking to decriminalize homelessness, make sure people had a place to sleep legally in the interim before they actually got permanent housing. So there's actually three prongs to it. And what Lori, what you and Paul have given us more sort of tangible items on how to implement that three-prong approach. So, you know, what does it take to actually get more permanent housing in this county? What does it take to actually move that forward? What does it take to actually have viable, you know, temporary shelter for people? Because that's going to become an issue in just a couple of months really quickly again. And thirdly, you know, if people aren't housed and they don't have shelter, how to stop their harassment. And so, you know, I harp often about the public awareness campaign, that people really don't believe that it's as bad as the advocates and the homeless say. And so I think that the campaign to open people's eyes about that is could be very powerful, and that's sort of an untapped tool so far. So that's my 2 cents, and maybe Ken has something else to add because he spent so much time presenting and addressing the issue of criminalization and trying to get through to the Poverty and Homeless Board.
Yeah, I think you summarized where we were very well. And I think the one thing I was always trying to emphasize on the Human Rights Commission is that we were the only group in town at that point that was really focusing on the rights of people who are unhoused. There was a lot of focus on, well, how do we get more shelter? What do we do about affordable housing? But nobody was paying particular attention to the rights of people not to be harassed, swept, and so forth. And I still think that's the case. The Lane County Board of for Poverty and Homelessness basically ignored criminalization in their strategic plan, even after I went in there and spent 45 minutes giving them my best shot at why criminalization was not, understatement, not a good thing to be pursuing, and shuffled it back over to the Human Rights Commission.
Right.
We had similar shuffling going on after we, at the joint meeting of the HRC and the City Council, we went in there asking them to hire as a consultant Eric Tars to advise on how to change the laws and so forth that might be making it more difficult for people to gain housing and to gain jobs. And we couldn't even call it decriminalization. We had to hide that word because the City Council didn't believe that we were criminalizing anything. So we hid the word, but we still asked for them to consult with Eric Tars. What they did instead under John Ruiz's leadership was to write to about 35 or 40 different people, asking them for them to contribute their thoughts. Fortunately, on the Human Rights Commission, we were able to add names into that pool of people that we knew would get it right away when they saw what was being asked them to do. That pile of paper all came back to John Ruiz. He sent it out, apparently, we sent it to the City Council, but there were crickets coming from there. He sent it out to department heads with the idea that, well, maybe they could look at what they were doing and see whether there was anything they could change that would help the practices that they were engaged in that might be making it worse for people who are homeless. Then they sent it back to the Human Rights Commission and said, okay, take care of this. And of course, at that point in time, the Human Rights Commission was undergoing changes in membership. Both Jennifer and I had to get off because of term limitations, things like that. The kinds of folks that are coming into the commission, we're not really activists or advocates for a whole lot of anything, and just sort of fell through the cracks, unfortunately. It's now being revived, I think, by the, I'm very pleased with the homelessness work group and how it's just kept at it, even though they don't have a cooperative HRC in the way that they would like to. But in any event, that's where we were. And I think that the suggestions that were made by Paul are, as usual, right on target and are the kinds of things that we can pursue. And I really like the Grants Pass court order. And I think there's a lot we can use, a lot of meat there that we can use, especially around the whole notion that, well, we're only fining people, so we're not punishing them. I think that has to be destroyed because you are punishing people. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah,
Well, and if I may, is it okay to chime in?
please do.
I mean, I think, you know, the Boise decision before the grants pass is even better. There was Judge Carter in LA, but then there's also about five cases that you can point to that didn't go very well. And I think it's important for people to recognize we also need to change the laws. Like they will tweak enforcement. Immediately after Boise, RAP is now working in 11 cities where the community groups are fighting sweeps. And as soon as Boise passed, those that were in the Ninth Circuit started using trespass and other things. I find it like incredibly frustrating that you devote all this time and energy to a court case where the judge is interpreting the laws as they stand right now. I think we still need to do that, but we also need to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah.
Just like we can do effective emergency services for people with no housing and be pushing for the restoration of affordable housing funding, we need to start doing that. There's so many local committees around homelessness. HUD set that up on purpose, local homeless coordinating boards, you know, and so you give people all these meetings to go to focus on their local community, and you take their time and energy and attention away from how are we going to address this systemically. You know, we have tried inviting our federal and state representative staff people to local meetings forever, and they rarely come. And if anybody thinks that local government's going to end homelessness on a national level, you're delusional. So if we really want to start changing the way that the shit is going down, we need to be looking at how we're going to impact the HUD priorities, because local government can tell you all they want that what you're bringing to them sounds good, but then they go and write their McKinney application to get the federal money to fund it, and they have to match the priorities of HUD and the ICH, or they don't get the money. It's a competitive grant cycle. It's like writing a grant to a foundation. They're pitted against each other like they were with PPE equipment. You know, like they're pitted against each other to write an application that's going to adhere to the guidelines and priorities of whoever happens to be in the White House at the time that the application's being written. And never has that been in the best interest of systemic change at the local level. So as we're doing this organizing campaign, we need to be connecting with others. I love that Earl Blumenauer was introducing the Homes for All Act with Omar, the guy out of Portland. And he was holding our report from 14 years ago that we had issued in his hand at the podium 6 months ago. So when we hit on it the right way, it'll stick and it'll have a life. But we need to be building that momentum as we're having our daily struggles as well.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So we've heard a couple of perspectives, and there's a lot of advocates in the call. So I'm wondering if there's some questions that have come up in the chat, Claire, and if you have questions, just tell us who the question is addressed to, and make sure you write it into the chat. So we have about another 20 minutes, 25 minutes to ask questions of the panel.
Okay, this is a question to Paul from Low Owens. Our Eugene City and Council had a meeting yesterday and heard that only about 87% of housing vouchers are being used, indicating that landlords are refusing folks with vouchers more than folks not needing housing. The TAC has decided that their second highest priority is landlord engagement. Do you have any data on how likely it might be to change landlords' minds on accepting vouchers, at least until we get a better system in place? And I also want to note that there's a lot of links and things in the chat that people should check out or copy for later.
There, I muted myself. I mean, there's a couple of projects that I've seen. There's one in Portland, I think it's called Join. And there's one in LA that's had varying degrees of success. The problem with the housing vouchers is no matter how cool the landlord is, the funding mechanism, the rent, is coming from HUD and from the local public housing authority. And that's never a fun funding stream, period. Even if you're a slum landlord, that's not a fun funding stream to deal with. And so it's a real challenge beyond just, oh, they're racist or they're classist, which in many cases is true. There's also the actual technical mechanism of the process these individual landlords have to go through in order to ensure that the money that they're being promised off of the voucher is actually going to show up every month and be renewable every year, because they're not. And again, it's where, you know, it was something that Clinton did in order to cover up the fact, just like when you see sweeps and you hear, oh, but they're getting referrals to the navigation center, drop-in center, shelter, whatever they're calling the program this week, housing first intake center, whatever. And it's a robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario, you know? And so you're able to give the pretense of doing something on this front end while other people aren't accessing that program because the beds are going to those that are being swept. And frankly, you're creating, you know, back end, you're hiding the fact that you're not bringing new resources to the table. The housing choice vouchers didn't bring new resources to the table. They justified that Clinton wasn't being as big of an idiot, or, you know, the other word, as he actually was, by saying, oh no, we're not displacing people and replacing them with higher income because the new units are all mixed income units. What we're doing is giving them a voucher so they can go choose where they want to live. That was never true. Point in time count will never give you an accurate assessment of how many people are unhoused in your community. And Housing First is an unfunded public relations campaign. If Housing First was real, it would be in the HUD housing budget and the USDA housing program budgets. It wouldn't be in the McKinney budget, and it wouldn't be a homeless program. It would be a housing program. And so we need to be calling these things out. Every human rights commission in the country should be cursing these guys out for continuing the Jim Crow era policing that we see today in our local communities. Every local government should be working with organizers and human rights groups to be demanding a restoration of affordable housing funding. Because as we saw with the TARP bailout and other times across this country, you know, when they want the freaking money, they find it. And in order for our input at the local level to have the kind of clout that we want it and need it to have, our input being accountable community representation, then it needs to be new guidelines on how money can be spent.
Great, thank you, Paul. We have just an announcement in the chat about the City Club program on Friday about anti-criminalization issues, featuring the police chief and also Cahoots. So another question, Paul, could you talk a few minutes about the pitfalls you have seen in other cities' attempts to engage in decriminalization efforts? You're muted, Paul.
I know, I'm sorry. I actually haven't seen, all right, so Austin did a decriminalization thing, and then the business community went ballistic and got it overturned, and now there's this ongoing feud between the neighborhood associations, the business improvement districts, and the business community and the Republican governor weighing in on it and threatening to send state troopers when Austin did not the Right to Rest Act, but they did a decriminalization local program. And that was probably the most visceral that I've seen in terms of local governments doing something decent, or at least starting to do something decent, and then getting a real pushback. Where we have seen across the board real pushback lately is the cities that did somewhat follow the CDC guidance around sweeps. And right after COVID hit and the shelter in place, you know, you started seeing a whole lot more people in the streets because the sweeps had cut back. And then people are freaking out about all the people that are in the streets. It's really important to remember, one, those weren't new unhoused people. That's what homelessness would look like if we weren't using the cops to make homeless people disappear all the time. And two, we ain't seen nothing yet. When the eviction moratoriums, the unemployment enhancement, the unemployment programs, when those things run out, which is really soon, and the undocumented workers that aren't getting even that, the numbers of homeless people in this country are going to be off the freaking hook. And we're not going to arrest our way out of it. And we're not going to tweak the goddamn continuum of care process to make it work. We need to get serious about the housing and treatment and employment needs of the people in our community.
Okay, Heather wants to hear more about what we should watch out for with the outreach and navigation center models. You just touched on that a little bit. And also what we should watch out for as the national spotlight shines on Cahoots.
Oh, me again? That's not fair. You can't. I mean, I started, you may have noticed I'm really old. So I started in '83 and we were all called crash pads. Then we were drop-in centers. Then we were emergency shelters. And then we were transitional shelter programs. And then we became one-stop centers and multi-service centers. And like, my God, we keep trying to rename it, thinking somehow it's going to be different than it already is. It's a place to crash. That's it. And they love to come up with new names, and then they do technical assistance programs, and they have a new model, or they come up with housing first with no housing money attached to it. I mean, we need to hold them accountable to playing these freaking games. You know, you can design a shelter in all kinds of different ways. It's still in the baseline to the person working in it and the person sleeping in it. It's a freaking shelter. And calling it something different, calling the police enforcement outreach because you attach a social worker to the cops, you know, using outreach workers as okay, the cops are right behind me. Do you want what I'm offering? That's not engagement. That's not involving the community in anything. That's a threat. And so we play these semantics with, well, if we just call it, you know, homeless court, we're not criminalizing. If we call it a civil penalty, we're not criminalizing. You're enforcing the same racist, classist laws, and you need to cut it out.
Right on. So here's a question for all the other panelists.
Yay!
To more discussion about funding. Defund the police is a current focus coming out of Black Lives Matter, but I wonder about the other potential pockets that we should be looking at and advocating for. CCOs, I don't know what that stands for. And I will say it despite that it makes me unpopular across the political spectrum, sales tax. Any of the other panelists want to speak? Okay.
So, well, one thing I'll speak to, and Heather can jump in as well, and this does have to do with defunding the police, is one of the things several people in Eugene are advocating for is to create an alternative dispatch system, because calls about people sleeping somewhere should not go through our EPD dispatch system. From a cost standpoint, it doesn't make sense. And also just how treating people with dignity, we don't need police to respond to those kind of calls. We need outreach workers, but we need outreach workers that are effective outreach workers and that avoids what Paul was just talking about. So I would say money should be moved from the police budget to creating this alternative dispatch system. And Heather, since we've talked about this a lot, do you want to add anything since you have more detailed ideas?
Well, what I can add is something that they did in Portland is they created something called a Here Together, and it was a program to try to raise sufficient money. They decided that the providers and people knew what really worked, but what we never did was approach the issue at the right scale. So that's one of the things that we're looking at possibly putting together here in Eugene to try to raise funding. It'll take a while before we can get it on the ballot. It's a ballot measure, but really outside of raising the scale of money we need and advocating with the feds for housing, I mean, those are, I think, our best options.
Thanks. I also wanted to add something here, which is there's a model in Oakland. Paul, I don't know if you are aware of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Collaborative. And the idea is to take the housing market out of the speculation, taking housing out of the speculator market. So establishing land trusts, establishing cooperative ownership so that money paid for housing goes to replicate a model where people aren't, where the resources aren't being taken out of the community. And it's a really exciting model to me because it's talking about totally changing the economy of housing. But of course, it's also a long shot. It's not going to house anybody immediately. I'd recommend looking it up online, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Collective, and I'm wondering if Paul is aware or worked with these folks at all.
No, I've worked with a couple of different land trust groups, but I haven't actually interacted with that particular one. Not yet. I'm gonna now that you mention it.
Are there some more questions in the queue?
No, I don't see any more questions, although there are a lot of comments and links on the queue that I suggest people check out. How can Eugene create a truly effective outreach system? That's from Lori. You just spoke to that a little bit, Lori, but
yeah, I mean, maybe, oh, so go ahead, Paul. Maybe you answered it by saying what shouldn't be created, but I mean, I think we're going down the road of creating, I think, exactly what you're telling us cities shouldn't create. And now it's a matter of how do we move off that path?
Well, I mean, no, I think what has changed for me when we started out, like in the early 80s, and there was no money, it was just community members responding, like there was a mutual aid thought process, you know, and for a lot of us, you know, like it was, well, hey, we just need to help a brother out, you know, type of a mindset to what the role of outreach was. And so when outreach becomes a controlling mechanism, or, you know, like you're doing outreach and you don't have access to what it is that people need. And you're fronting for police departments and public works crews that are going to come behind you. Like, that's not outreach. That's not outreach. Like, outreach is a community-based response to what's happening. And if the city had just kept funding the groups that were already doing the outreach instead of setting up new systems of outreach with documented interactions and how many got referred to this, like we start institutionalizing the interactions, it becomes an entity talking to an individual as opposed to a community member talking to a community member. And, you know, like when you guys were mentioning that stuff about cahoots back in the day, 431-7400. Like that was the mobile assistance patrol phone number. Anybody that was in the community, that like everybody knew if somebody was too drunk, too high to keep their shit together, you called 431-7400 because it was all voluntary. It would take you to detox. It would take you to the drop-in center, and it had a harm reduction model drop-in center. And we all knew that number, and we all used it. And, you know, like that's community members helping out community members. We would not call 911 to help out a friend of mine. Are you kidding? Like, that's not the number I'm going to call to seek help for a community member. Like, that's just not going to happen. And so, like, outreach in its purest form, we live as organizers, we live off of doing outreach. RAP won't work with a group that doesn't do street outreach, you know, but if you're doing it attached to a program implementation of policing and harassment, I don't care what your relationship is, you sure as hell ain't working with us.
So about that, Paul, what kind of organization would you want to work with in terms of changing that mutual infrastructure in a community? What are you looking for?
Well, it was one of the truly, probably only, but it was one of the really beautiful things with the COVID pandemic was the amount of mutual aid that people just immediately started doing. And Cop Watch, which has always done a particular role, you know, started bringing food and stuff out to people. Like, you know, the places that had to close down because of COVID started doing street outreach, set, you know, tents, hand wash stations. You know, in Portland, there, thanks to Monica Beamer, there's 29 hand wash stations all over the freaking city being maintained by local people in the area where the hand wash station is. Riot ribs, like it's amazing. Every night the feds take their grill and their tables and everything. And then every morning the community members bring that shit right back. You know, so like to me, that's the kind of outreach I think of when I think about outreach. That's awesome. Just bringing people trash bags at the encampment. Yeah. You know, it might say, or God forbid, clean freaking socks. You know, like there's just things that are really basic, you know, needs that people have, and the mutual respect of bringing to, not just going and asking questions to remove from. Yeah. You know, and building community in that context, I think, is really important.
So we have another question here. Before COVID appeared, many community members were discussing conversations between Eugene PD and Eugene Wake Up, which is a group that claimed to address lawlessness. Has anyone in this group been able to have productive conversations with those members? I'm concerned that this group is still influencing EPD and the City Council.
I can speak to that briefly. I think we all should be concerned that this group has a tremendous amount of influence, maybe less so, no, you know what, EPD and City Council. And I think any kind of significant change in focus within the city, we have to get the business community on board, or at least strong enough voices within the business community to get City Council to act. And so there are people who are doing some of that outreach to businesses and business associations like the Chamber and others. But certainly it's a small group, and if anyone else wants to help with that, noted in the chat. And actually, I think hearing Paul's brief mention of what happened in Austin is a reminder. If you don't get the business community on board up front, they could tank any attempts that City Council makes to make any of these changes.
Well, and it helped that they had a conservative neoliberal Republican governor too. So,
and that was Austin.
Yeah. Right. But still, I think that's a real issue here and a real obstacle to change.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was just
There are a couple questions here about addressing the issue in rural areas. Does anybody have information or actions in that arena? And that'll be the last point because it's 5 till.
I'll just say I never respected groups more than the really small rural groups that I work with, because when you talk about who has impact at City Hall or with the City Council or with the cops, you ain't seen nothing till you've seen some of these rural communities, and nobody, the cops, none of them think anybody's watching. And, you know, there's locals on patrol where they're literally going out and beating people up and chasing them out of the areas. And the fighters, the people and the community members that fight back, they are the toughest, bravest organizers you'll ever see. You guys have the Rural Organizing Project, and they're an amazing organization. But you got to be pretty damn serious to be taking on these issues in rural communities.
So, Jennifer, is there anything else we got to wrap up?
No, I think though that we should encourage people to put their email address in the chat so that they can get more of the documents and more of the links that Lori and Heather and Paul have mentioned. Some of these reports. Go to the Housing Not Handcuffs website, sign the pledge of support, get your organization to sign that pledge of support. We want to say thank you to Cooperation Eugene for hosting our meeting, and Claire and Joshua for your time. Thanks so much. And I don't know about you all, but I feel like this has been a really powerful reset in terms of having action items and things to really pursue and do something about. And you know, it's always great and fun to meet, but we really have to do something. And Heather Birch from Heather Buck rather, from the Lane County Commissioner yesterday, as they were wrapping up around the TACS recap, mentioned that she if we do get a bond measure passed, if we do get a big chunk of money, you know, raised, millions of dollars, that she does want to see something that has longevity, that is, you know, puts housing, individual housing units in the hands of people who are currently unhoused. And so she is definitely one of the people that we could be approaching, pursuing. She's thinking about community trust. That's what's on her mind. I think a lot of people have seen how the Square One Villages, how that worked. And so that we're not just raising bond money and then it just getting pissed away, that we actually create housing that's long-term. So I thank you, Paul, for your time, and we'll be back in touch with you.
Thanks. Well, yeah, you can't get rid of me that easy.
Thank you all for being here today.
A quick tip, if you're in the chat box, you could just copy it all and paste it into a Word doc for later. That's what I always do if you want to check out the links and what have you.
And
Awesome.
Ken, it was great to see you, brother.